Welcome back to Case Breakdown Teen Perspective. I'm Julia, and this is a podcast where I take real criminal law cases and break them down from the perspective of a teenager who's interested in criminal law. And if you've listened to the two first episodes, you already know that I don't want this podcast to just be me telling you what happened. I want to actually ask the questions that make these cases complicated, because when you hear about a murder case, it can be really easy to put everyone into two categories: a victim, criminal, innocent, guilty, good or bad. But what happens when the people accused of a crime also claim that they were victims themselves? And what happens when the crime happened more than 30 years ago, but people are still debating whether justice was actually served? That is exactly what we will be talking about today. The Menendez brothers. Eric and Lyle Menendez, two brothers, one family, a murder case that became one of the biggest trials in America, two separate trials actually, and a controversial defense, and a case that has come back into public conversation decades later. But before we get into it, I want to say something. This case involves allegations of serious abuse, so I'm not going to go into graphic details. That's not necessary to understand the legal issue. Instead, we're going to focus on the evidence, the arguments, the trials, the verdicts, and the bigger question. Can someone be both a victim and responsible for a crime at the exact same time? So let's start off by talking about who were the Menendez brothers. Let's start with Eric and Lyle. The Menendez family lived in Beverly Hills, California. Their father, Jose Menendez, was a successful entertainment executive, and their mother, Kitty, was a homemaker. The family was wealthy. They lived in a large house, and from the outside, they looked like a pretty typical wealthy Beverly Hills family. But according to Eric and Lyle, what was happening inside their home was completely different from what people saw from the outside. The brothers later stated that they had experienced years of abuse from their parents, particularly their father. The allegation became one of the central issues of this entire case. But at the time, nobody outside the family knew exactly what was happening. And then on August 20th, 1989, Jose and Kitty Menendez were killed inside their home. Eric was 18, Lyle was 21. And suddenly, these two young men were at the center of a murder investigation. At first, investigators didn't immediately know who had committed the killings. And this is where the story gets super interesting, because Eric and Lyle didn't immediately look like the suspects. They were the sons. They were grieving, and investigators initially didn't have an obvious explanation for why someone would want to kill Jose and Kitty. But eventually, investigators began looking more closely at the brothers. And one of the biggest things prosecutors would later point to was what happened after their parents' deaths. The brothers began spending large amounts of money. They purchased expensive items and lived a lifestyle that prosecutors argued was suspicious. And prosecutors had a theory. They believed the brothers had killed their parents because they wanted their money. That became a huge part of the prosecution's case. But the defense had another explanation. They said the brothers weren't motivated by money. They said years of abuse and fear had shaped what happened, and that completely changed the legal question, because now the jury wasn't just deciding, did Eric and Lyle kill their parents? The brothers' defense essentially required the jury to consider what was happening in their minds when they did it, and that distinction is super important in this case. So let's move on to the part of the investigation. After the killings, investigators started trying to figure out who could have had a motive. At first, there were different theories, but eventually suspicion focused on Eric and Lyle. And here's one of the things that makes this case so interesting. The brothers weren't immediately arrested. There was a period where they were living their lives, and during that time, they were spending money, a lot of money. They bought expensive clothes, they bought cars, they went on trips, and prosecutors later used this behavior to argue that their parents' deaths had given them access to the family's wealth. From the prosecution's perspective, it looked like a motive, but the defense argued that their behavior didn't prove why the killings happened, and that's something that comes up constantly in these criminal cases. So what does a piece of evidence actually prove? Because one piece of evidence can be interpreted in completely different ways. Imagine someone commits a crime and then acts strangely afterward. Does that prove they're guilty? Well, it doesn't automatically. It might make them suspicious. It might make them become part of a larger case, but a jury has to look at everything together. That's why criminal trials are so complicated. It is rarely, here is one piece of evidence, therefore this person is guilty. It's more along the lines of, you need the timeline, you need the testimony, here's the physical evidence, here's the defendant's behavior, here's the prosecution's theory, here's the defense's theory. Now the jury has to decide whether the prosecution has actually proved the case beyond a reasonable doubt. And eventually, investigators got closer to the brothers. One of the major developments happened when Eric confessed to killing his parents. But this wasn't a confession to the police. Eric had spoken to his therapist about what had happened, and that information eventually became known to the investigators. The details surrounding the confession and therapist-patient confidentiality became another major legal issue. Think about that. Imagine telling something incredibly serious to a therapist because you think it's confidential. Then imagine that information eventually becoming part of a criminal investigation. That raises an entirely different question. When does confidentiality have limits? And that's another reason this case became so complicated. It was not just a murder trial. It involved questions about evidence, mental state, confidentiality, abuse, motive, and criminal responsibility. Eventually, both brothers were arrested, and the case moved toward trial. Now, let's talk about the prosecution's argument. The prosecution said the brothers planned the killings. They argued that the motive was financial, their parents were wealthy, the brothers stood to inherit money, and after the killings, they spent the money. So the prosecution's theory was basically they wanted the money, they planned the killings, they killed their parents, and then they began enjoying the financial benefits. And honestly, from a prosecutor's perspective, that's a pretty straightforward narrative. It gives the jury a motive, it gives them a timeline, and it gives them behavior that the prosecution can point to afterward. But then there's the defense. And the defense was basically saying, you're looking at this completely wrong. They weren't calculating their way into an inheritance. They were terrified. They had experienced years of abuse, and they believed they were in danger. Now, whether you believe that explanation or not, you can see why the jury had an incredibly difficult job, because the two sides weren't just disagreeing about one detail. They were presenting two completely different versions of reality. Now, this is where I want to slow down, because this is probably the part of the case that people know most about today. Eric and Lyle testified about alleged abuse within their family. Their defense attorneys argued that this history was essential to understanding their behavior. The defense wasn't simply saying they had a bad childhood. They were trying to explain the brothers' state of mind, and that matters because the law can take a person's mental state into account. But here's the complicated part of it all. A history of abuse doesn't automatically make a killing legally justified. That's not to the legal arguments they were making about the brothers' actions. And that's 10 times harder because the jury had to think about questions like, did the brothers genuinely believe they were in danger? Was the belief reasonable under the law? Did they believe the danger was immediately? And how much weight should the alleged history of abuse have? And those questions aren't questions that can be answered with a simple yes or no. And this is one of the reasons I think this case is so interesting for teenagers specifically, because we hear a lot about mental health, trauma, abuse, and how experiences affect people. But criminal law has to turn those complicated human experiences into legal standards. And human beings aren't legal standards. That's the issue. So the first trial began in 1993, and something unusual happened. Eric and Lyle were tried separately. Each brother had his own jury, and the defense presented substantial evidence about the alleged abuse. The brothers testified, other witnesses testified, the prosecution presented its argument about money and planning, and after everything was presented, the juries couldn't reach unanimous verdicts. They were deadlocked. So the judge declared mistrials. And I actually didn't know what mistrials meant before this case, so if you're wondering what that means, it's basically meaning the trial ended without a final verdict because the jury couldn't reach the required decision. So after all of that, no final conviction, the case simply just wasn't over. There would be another trial. And in this other trial is where the case shifted significantly. The second trial began in 1995, but this time there was one jury, and the evidence wasn't exactly the same. Some evidence relating to the abuse allegations was limited or excluded. That became extremely important because imagine being a juror, you're hearing these murder cases, the defense says, you need to understand what these brothers experienced because it explains why they acted. But then you don't hear all of the evidence that another jury heard during the first trial. That can change the way you understand the defense. And that's essentially what happened. The prosecution continued to argue that the killings were planned and motivated by money. The defense continued to argue that the brothers' history of abuse and fear was critical, but the second jury did end up reaching a verdict. In 1996, Eric and Lyle were convicted of first-degree murder. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And for a while, that looked like the end of the story, but it really wasn't. So why are we still talking about this case? Because people disagree whether the legal system fully understood the brothers' claims about abuse. Some people believe that the prosecution's theory makes the most sense. They point to the planning, the spending, and the evidence surrounding the killings. They argue that the brothers should be held responsible for deliberately killing their parents. Other people believe the abuse allegations were extremely important and weren't given enough weight. They argue that the brothers' experiences should have been considered more seriously when evaluating their state of mind. And then there are people somewhere in the middle. People who believe, yes, they committed the killings, but yes, their history of abuse matters too. And honestly, that middle ground is where I think the case gets really interesting because I don't think recognizing someone's victimization automatically means saying they shouldn't be responsible for what they did. Those are separate questions. You can believe someone was harmed and you can believe they committed a crime. Both things can be true. Now, let's talk about the media's role, because it has changed dramatically since the original trials. The Menendez case was heavily covered when it happened, but decades later, it came back. Documentaries, TV shows, podcasts, TikTok, YouTube, and suddenly, an old case became relevant to a completely new generation. And honestly, this is where I think case breakdown from a teen perspective fits into the conversation because my generation consumes so much true crime. You open TikTok and there's another case. You open YouTube and there's another documentary. You see someone explain a trial in 60 seconds, and sometimes that can be really educational, but it can also be dangerous because a criminal case can be reduced to entertainment. And these aren't fictional characters. These are real people, real victims, real defendants, real family with real consequences. So when we are discussing cases like this, I think we have to remember that there's a difference between being interested in criminal justice and treating someone's tragedy like entertainment. And there's another problem. Social media often gives you a conclusion before you even know the facts. Someone says they were obviously innocent or they were obviously guilty, and then you start looking for information that supports what you've already decided. That's confirmation bias, and lawyers and jurors have to fight against that because the question isn't, what do I believe? The question is, what does the evidence actually show? Now, let's jump forward several decades. The brothers remained in prison, but public interest in the case started increasing again. New evidence and renewed attention to the abuse allegations led to new legal arguments about their sentences, and eventually, in 2025, a judge reduced their sentence from life without parole to 50 years to life. That didn't mean that they're free. It didn't mean that they were found innocent. It meant that they became more eligible for parole because of their age at the time of the crimes and the new sentence. And that distinction is really important. Being eligible for parole doesn't guarantee release. A parole board still has to decide whether someone should be released. In August 2025, both brothers had parole hearings, and both were denied parole for 3 years. So despite all the renewed attention, the brothers remained incarcerated. And that brings us to where the case stands today. Okay, so now we're getting to the question that everyone's probably thinking right now, and I'm thinking myself. Were Eric and Lyle victims? Were they murderers? Or were they both? And honestly, I think that's the wrong kind of frame to the question because the words victim and murderer aren't mutually exclusive. Someone can experience abuse and still commit a crime. Someone can be traumatized and still be legally responsible for their actions. Someone can deserve empathy and still face consequences. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons from this case. Sometimes people want criminal cases to have one clear side, But life isn't really always like that. Let's try to imagine something. I'm sitting in that courtroom. I'm a juror. I have no TikTok, no Netflix documentary, no podcast, no social media. I'm only allowed to consider the evidence presented in court and the instructions from the judge. The prosecution tells me these brothers planned the killings. They wanted money, they acted deliberately, they benefited financially afterward. The defense tells me the brothers experienced years of abuse. They were afraid, their history shaped their state of mind. And now I'm sitting there, I have to make a decision. And I think the hardest part for anyone really would be separating emotion from evidence, because obviously hearing allegations of abuse would affect you emotionally. But being a juror isn't about choosing the person you feel most sorry for. It's about deciding whether the prosecution proved the charges under the legal standard. And that's incredibly difficult because you're dealing with human beings, not math problems, not a multiple choice test, human beings. For me, the absolute biggest question in this case isn't even did they kill their parents. We know they did. They confessed. The bigger question is, how should the justice system evaluate someone who commits a crime after experiencing long-term abuse? Because that's much a bigger question than just this case, and it's still relevant today. How should courts understand trauma? How should evidence of abuse be presented? And how should juries evaluate someone's state of mind? Those are really difficult questions, and I don't think there's one perfect answer, but that's why case deciding how society responds. I think the biggest thing this case taught me is that justice and sympathy are not the same thing. You can feel sympathy for someone without believing that they are innocent, and you can believe someone should be punished without believing their entire life story is irrelevant. I also think this case taught me how important evidence is, because when you are watching a documentary, you get a curated version of the story. When you're watching TikTok, you're getting an even more condensed version. But in a courtroom, the details matter. What was said? Who said it? When did they say it? Can it be verified? Was the evidence allowed? What does the law actually require? Those questions matter more than whether a story sounds convincing. And honestly, that's something I want to keep reminding myself as I learn more about criminal law. Interesting simply does not mean true, and convincing doesn't always mean proven. So if at this point you're asking, well, Julia, do you think the Menendez brothers were victims or murderers? My answer to that question would be, I think the case is much more complicated than choosing one. They were convicted of murdering their parents. That is the legal outcome. But their claims about abuse and their psychological state are also an important part of understanding the case. And I think it's really fair to debate whether those issues were handled appropriately during the original trials. What I don't think is fair is that pretending a Netflix episode can give us the complete answer, because it can't, and neither can I. That's not the point of this podcast. The point isn't for me to tell you this is what you should think. The point is for me to say, here's what happened, here's what the prosecution said, here's what the defense says, here's what the law says, now let's think about it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Menendez brothers case, a case that started in Beverly Hills in 1989, a case that went through 2 trials, a case that resulted in convictions, and a case that more than 3 decades later is still being debated. And I think that's exactly why it's worth talking about, because criminal justice isn't always about finding the easiest answer. Sometimes it's about sitting with the uncomfortable questions, and sometimes it's about realizing that someone can be responsible for something terrible while still having experienced terrible things themselves. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Case Breakdown Teen Perspective.